When we speak of the empath, we do not speak of a gift, nor of a virtue bestowed from the heavens at birth. We speak of a wound, and more precisely, we speak of the psychic consequence of a soul that has been pierced too many times before it ever learned the word I. You see, my friends, the empath is not born. The empath is shaped, chiseled out of pain, molded by exposure to the emotional storms of others, and conditioned into hyper-attunement, not through grace, but through necessity. The common conception romanticizes the empath as a spiritual elite, one endowed with preternatural sensitivity, but the truth is far less glorious and far more chilling. An empath is what becomes of a child who was never allowed to center their own needs, who had to feel into others in order to survive, whose antennae had to sharpen to detect shifts in mood like radar systems, trained to pick up the slightest tremor before the earthquake. What the world calls a gift is, in truth, a defense mechanism, so refined, so embedded, that the one who carries it no longer sees the distinction between their own energy and the waves of others crashing over their soul. You must understand, this hypersensitivity is the adaptation of the psyche to prolonged exposure to chaos. It is the archetype of the wounded healer. But before it heals, it absorbs. And in this absorption, the self begins to fracture. A child who learns that love is contingent upon being emotionally available to everyone else soon learns to suppress the cries of their own soul. Their identity, rather than being formed from within, is formed in the reflections of others. They become mirrors rather than bodies. They become echoes rather than voices. This is where the chilling truth begins to sink in what masquerades as intuition is often unresolved, trauma dressed in sacred clothing. The empath intuits not because they are divinely gifted, but because their survival once depended on it, and the psychic body never forgets, even when years have passed, and the narcissistic mother is no longer present, or the alcoholic father has long disappeared. The empath continues scanning, predicting, anticipating. They cannot help but step into the shoes of others, for they have never truly learned how to stand in their own. And what of the shadow? For no exploration of this nature can be complete without descending into the underworld of the unconscious. The empath's shadow is the suppressed rage of never being seen. It is the grief of living life as a receptor rather than a participant. It is the inner child screaming behind a smile, aching to matter beyond their usefulness to others. But they rarely acknowledge this. Why? Because to do so would be to betray the very identity they believe keeps them safe. To admit their resentment, their exhaustion, would be to jeopardize the one thing they believe gives them value, their ability to hold space for others. And here lies the paradox. The more one over-identifies with being an empath, the further they drift from their true self. The archetype becomes a mask. And the mask, as I have so often said, is not what we wear to hide from others, but what we wear to hide from ourselves. There is something archetypal here, something ancient. In myths, the seer, the oracle, have the prophet. Those who feel beyond the visible are often those who have suffered most. They are marked by tragedy. Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess, was cursed to always speak truth but never be believed. Tiresias, the blind seer, was struck by divine punishment. Their sight came not from blessing, but from rupture. The empath is no different. Their emotional clairvoyance is not a superpower. It is the byproduct of suffering. And unless they reckon with this truth, they will forever bleed empathy for others without ever learning to love themselves. The empath, then, is the one who walks through life with open wounds, camouflaged as open hearts. They do not know boundaries, because boundaries were never modeled for them. They confuse compassion with codependency, connection with obligation, love with self-erasure. They think they are helping when they are, in fact, abandoning themselves. What happens, I ask you, when you feel too much for too long? The psyche, overloaded, begins to dissociate. It numbs in one place and overfeels in another. It creates complexes. And one of the most potent complexes of the empath is the savior complex. They seek brokenness in others, not out of altruism, but because healing another becomes a proxy for healing the wound within. But no matter how many people they rescue, the child within remains unseen. It is a tragic dance of projection. If I can save them, maybe someone will finally save me. The true healing of the empath begins not in their capacity to feel, but in their courage to stop absorbing, to stop identifying their worth through their attunement to others. They must, paradoxically, allow themselves to feel selfish, not in the sense of harming others, but in the radical act of turning inward. This is not egoism. This is individuation. And oh, how resistant the empath is to individuation, because their entire persona has been built around being selfless, around being the one who listens, who comforts, who absorbs. The moment they begin to speak their truth, to say no, to disengage from toxic dynamics, they are wrecked with guilt. But guilt, in this case, is not the voice of morality. It is the echo of old conditioning. It is the voice of the wounded child fearing abandonment if they no longer perform emotional labor. My friends, I do not say these things to condemn the empath. I say them to liberate. For what the world needs is not more people who feel everything. What the world needs is people who feel deeply but remain rooted in the self. To feel and remain whole. That is the true task. We must look also at the archetype of the mother, both personal and collective. For many empaths, the mother was emotionally unstable, inconsistent, or overly enmeshed. The child became the caretaker. This role reversal is psychic theft. The child is robbed of their right to be held and instead becomes the holder. And when the mother archetype is distorted, the individual cannot access the inner wellspring of nurturance. They seek it externally, through caretaking others, hoping unconsciously that someone will finally turn to them and say, "You too deserve to be held." It is here that the empath's journey must turn inward. They must begin to mother themselves, to reparent, to become the very source of validation and love they have sought in others. Only then does the wound begin to close. Only then can the empath feel without drowning, love without losing themselves, and give without bleeding. Let us speak also of dreams. The unconscious speaks in symbols And many empaths report dreams of water, of floods, of drowning, of oceans too vast to cross. These are not mere dreams. These are messages. The water is the emotional body, and the dreamer is submerged, overwhelmed, unable to breathe. The unconscious is saying, you are too deep in others. You have forgotten the shore of the self. And sometimes the dream contains a shadow figure, a version of the dreamer who is cold, detached, even cruel. This is the rejected aspect of the self that says enough. This is the part the empath fears becoming the one who sets limits. But it is precisely this shadow that holds the key to integration. For the empath to heal, they must reclaim the capacity to say no, to feel anger, to not always be available. Without this, they remain fragmented, forever seeking in others what can only be found within. The healing of the empath is not in softening further, it is in becoming whole. And wholeness, as I have long taught, is not perfection. It is integration, to integrate the shadow, to integrate the rage, to stop fearing the boundaries that make them feel like they are betraying their nature. The empaths must realize boundaries are not betrayal, they are the scaffolding of the soul. And now we come to the most difficult part, grief. The empath must grieve the years they spent over-feeling, over-giving, overextending. They must grieve the loss of childhood, of innocence, of the fantasy, that if they were just good enough, sensitive enough, selfless enough, someone would finally see them. That grief is sacred. It is the doorway to rebirth, and in that rebirth, they no longer have to be the empath. They get to be the self-complex, integrated, powerful, no longer defined by others' needs, but animated by their own essence. They still feel, but they are no longer consumed. And so I invite you now to enter with me into the labyrinth of the soul, where the empath, the one who feels too much, too deeply, too instinctively, is not a miracle of temperament, but a scar carved into sensitivity by the sword of early abandonment. You see, the empath does not emerge because they were designed to absorb all emotion. They arise because no one ever held their own. In the earliest season of life, where the child's nervous system is still fusing with the image of the world, the wound begins. The mother who is absent, not physically, but emotionally. The father whose gaze skims over the child's pain without seeing it. The household where chaos sings louder than safety. These are the crypts in which the empath is formed, not as a gift, but as an adaptation, unnecessary, exquisite, devastating adaptation. The empath then is not simply tuned in, they are hyper-attuned. Yes, but not from choice. The child's psyche, in a desperate attempt to stay safe, becomes the watcher. It begins to absorb not only what is said, but what is not said. The silences between words, the tremor in the air when violence is near, the false smile that masks contempt. Their antennae grow long and thin and tremble at every subtle frequency. But here is the chilling part, because no one attuned to them, they were left with no choice but to attune to everyone else. Their survival depended on it. And now, decades later, The empath wonders why they cannot turn it off, why crowds feel like knives, why they weep when no one else does, why they attract the broken, the takers, the hollow ones who see in the empath not a soul, but a source of supply. Because the empath's wound has never been honored, only praised. You're so caring, they're told, you always understand, but inside they are drowning in everyone else's grief while their own remains unnamed. Empaths are not born, they are forged in the crucible of unmet needs, and in this forge something paradoxical happens. They become beautiful. Because the psyche, even in pain, seeks wholeness. The empath's sensitivity is a compensation, a bloom that grows from the shadowed soil of trauma. The child who wasn't loved learns to love others with holy ferocity. The child whose pain was ignored becomes fluent in pain itself. But this fluency is costly. It requires the suppression of their own needs, their own rage, their own darkness. It demands the burial of the true self beneath the socially acceptable mask of kindness. And this, my dear listener, is where the shadow creeps in. For what is not expressed becomes possessed. The empath, praised for their light, often hides a deep, howling darkness within a rage that they are not permitted to feel, a despair that terrifies them, but it is there, buried beneath years of serving others, and unless it is met, welcomed, and integrated, it will turn against them. The empaths will begin to collapse under their own weight. They will experience fatigue, not of the body, but of the soul. They will lose the thread of their identity, unable to differentiate between their own emotions and those they have absorbed. I have seen it time and time again in my patients. The woman who breaks down weeping in my office and says, I don't know who I am anymore. The man who cannot sleep because he lies awake worrying about people he barely knows. The intuitive child who grew into an anxious adult. Their wound was never named, and because it was never named, it grew into an identity. They became the empath, unaware that this very identity is built atop a wound. The gift they were praised for was actually the price they paid for love they never received. In mythology, there is always a price for vision. To see the unseen is to be both blessed and cursed. The empath, like the seer of old, often pays this price with their own wholeness. But there is a way through, not around, not above, but through. And it begins by descending into the wound itself. To be whole, the empath must become aware. They must see their sensitivity not only as a strength, but as a survival strategy that has outlived its usefulness. They must ask, when did I first learn that I had to feel everything? When did my body first tighten in fear that someone else's mood might explode? When did I decide unconsciously that my feelings were less important than keeping the peace? These are not intellectual questions. These are questions for the dream world, for the somatic intelligence of the body, for the silence beneath words. And here the archetypes return the wounded child, weeping beneath the armor of adulthood, the caregiver tirelessly serving others to earn love, the martyr sacrificing self to avoid abandonment. These are not metaphors. These are the living figures in the inner theater And until the empath confronts them, they will remain puppets pulled by invisible threads. But when the empath truly sees the pattern, a rupture occurs. And in that rupture, healing begins. The empath must reclaim their right to be angry, to be unavailable, to be misunderstood. These are revolutionary acts for a soul trained to disappear. They must stand in front of the mirror and say, I matter, my pain matters, my energy is not free. They must learn the sacred boundary, not a wall, but a skin, not a fortress, but a flame, one that says, I am here, I feel you, but I will not carry you. That is the difference between empathy and enmeshment. And the empath must learn it, or else drown. You see, true empathy begins not with others, but with the self. To walk the road of individuation, the empath must turn inward. They must feel what they have always avoided, their own grief, their own loneliness, their own unmet hunger. It is a terrifying path, for it asks them to abandon the role they've played their whole life, but on the other side, there is freedom. Not the freedom to feel everything, but the freedom the freedom to choose, to discern, to say, this is mine, that is not. And in that moment, the empath is no longer a wounded child in an adult's body. They are a sovereign being, a mystic who feels by choice, not by compulsion, a soul who knows their power lies not in absorbing others, but in radiating truth from within. Empaths are not born, they are wounded, but wounds, when honored, become portals, they become holy. And so the wound becomes the altar where the empath bends low, not in worship of pain, but in a desperate act of soul preservation. The wound, unacknowledged, festers in silence. And silence, when prolonged, becomes the language of the unconscious. If the individual does not name their suffering will name them. It will carve their personality into a shape, not of their choosing, but of their avoidance. They will wear masks of harmony, while inside the animus rages in rebellion. They will feed everyone else from the cup of compassion, unaware that the cup has been cracked since childhood. What the world calls an empath is not a gift from the stars, nor a celestial soul, more attuned to divine vibration, but more truthfully, it is the adaptation of a child who learned that their safety depended on the moods of those around them. It is a trauma response transmuted into personality. The empath became a mirror, not out of mystical ability, but because they were never allowed to be a window. They were taught early, see everything, feel everything, but do not let anyone see you. And so, to survive, they disappeared. Now, in the theater of adult relationships, the empath will play out the old script again and again, unconsciously drawn to those who wound in familiar ways. Why? Because the psyche, in its archetypal quest for completion, returns to the scene of the injury, not to suffer, but to heal. Yet healing cannot occur in the repetition of the same unconscious roles. The one who was once a child, trained in emotional weather forecasting, must now become the adult who confronts the weather within. Otherwise, they are doomed to spend their life forecasting other people's storms and neglecting their own. I must warn you, this is the perilous point in the journey of individuation. For many empaths, the realization that their gift is not purely divine but forged in the furnace of early abandonment can be shattering. They want to believe they are special in a way that is untouched by suffering. But what is more sacred than the transformation of pain into power? What is more holy than the scar that becomes sight? Let us not romanticize the empath, nor condemn them. Let us understand them. They are often confused by their own depths, bewildered by the fact that they feel pain before the pain has even been spoken. They are the children who walked into rooms and felt tension like smoke. They are the adolescents who soothed rage not their own. They are the adults who whisper, "I'm fine," while bleeding invisibly. And until the unconscious contract they made to keep the peace at the expense of their own presence is revoked, they will remain trapped in cycles of martyrdom. To heal, the empath must reclaim what they lost in the process of becoming good. Often, it is their anger, exiled and demonized, that must be welcomed home. Anger is not evil. It is the heat of your boundaries trying to remember themselves. The empath must also grieve the years they spent tending to the gardens of others while their own soul wilted. Grieve the people they thought they could save and who never wanted saving. Grieve the belief that love must be earned through emotional labor. And here the alchemical process begins when the empath turns inward, when they stop scanning the emotional horizons of others and begin mapping their own interior world. The transformation is astonishing. Their sensitivity, once reactive, becomes sovereign. They no longer absorb pain, they witness it. They no longer rescue, they respect. They no longer dissolve in order to connect. They remain whole and allow others the dignity of doing the same. The archetype of the wounded healer emerges here, not as a myth of saviorhood, but as a mirror of inner integration. In Greek myth, Chiron was the centaur who could heal others but not himself until he chose death, a symbolic death of identity. In this sacrifice, he transcended his wound. The empath too must allow the old self, the identity built on suffering, to die. Only then can a new self, one rooted in true power, emerge. And this is the ultimate truth. Empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. Empathy with consciousness is transformation. The empath is not here to carry everyone's pain. They are here to become so aware of their own that they illuminate the path for others to do the same. Not by absorbing, but by embodying. Not by merging, but by standing firm. Not by pleasing, but by being. Now, I ask you, if you recognized yourself in these words, are you willing to meet the child in you who became an empath, not by nature, but by necessity? Are you willing to hold them, to love them, to tell them, you do not have to earn love by disappearing. You are allowed to exist fully, fiercely, unapologetically, for until you do, the archetype will repeat itself in every relationship, every job, every spiritual path, a loop of unconscious compassion that depletes the soul. You are not weak because you feel deeply, but you are wounded. If you cannot stop yourself from carrying what does not belong to you, And the healing begins not by becoming less sensitive, but by becoming more self-aware. It is not the feeling that is the problem, it is the forgetting of your own center. So I leave you with this. You were not born to disappear into other people's shadows. You were born to illuminate your own, and from that sacred illumination, you do not save the world. You show it what it means to be whole. And so, when you feel the pain of the world with such excruciating precision, when you anticipate shifts in others' moods before even they become aware, do not assume this is simply a miraculous spiritual sensitivity bestowed at birth. No, the roots are deeper and darker. These abilities are adaptations of a child once desperate to remain safe in a chaotic emotional field. It is the child who became the parent's shadow interpreter. The empath, often unknowingly, was the one who decoded the unspoken, who sensed the rising storm behind the father's silence or the tear behind the mother's smile. They survived, not by brute strength, but by developing a radar so refined it could catch even the subtlest tremor of unease in the air. But this very radar, so praised in adulthood, was forged in crucibles of neglect, rejection, and invisible trauma. Empathy, when born from wound, is a double-edged blade. It can heal or harm, depending on whether it is directed inward or outward. You see, many empaths become healers for others, yet remain wounded children within, terrified of turning their gift upon themselves. For to feel one's own pain, the original pain, is to face the unbearable truth that the love they gave to others was once denied to themselves. And here we arrive at the chilling truth: empaths are not born, they are forged. They emerge not from divine bestowal, but from the silent suffering of early psychic injuries. To understand this more fully, we must return to the concept of the wound as sacred. In myth, the wound is always the beginning of the journey. The Grail Knights each bore a wound that drove their quest. The Fisher King, eternally bleeding, held the land in decay until the right question was asked: what ails thee? That question, innocent and soul-focused, is the very question the wounded empath must ask of their inner child. But how many dare ask it? How many empaths, intoxicated by their ability to comfort others, truly stop and ask themselves, what is the origin of my sensitivity? What unseen wound am I tending in others that mirrors my own? Without this inquiry, empathy becomes a prison of projected caregiving. One becomes addicted to saving others, to feeling needed, not because of virtue, but because of unconscious identification with the wounded. The wounded healer archetype then becomes active, but not yet transcended. For only when the healer recognizes their wound and ceases to identify solely through it, does the transformation into a whole being occur. To carry the wound as a symbol, rather than a mask, is to be initiated into authentic healing, not of others first, but of the self. Empaths, in their shadow, are often boundaryless. Why? Because they learned, perhaps before they had language, that love was conditional upon their merging. They were rewarded for attuning, for being agreeable, for anticipating others' needs, and punished subtly or harshly for asserting their own. The psychic walls were torn down in infancy, not as a noble sacrifice, but as a survival mechanism. Thus, the absence of boundaries in the adult empath is not a virtue, it is a scar. And until that is seen, until it is honored and mourned, the empath will continue to confuse martyrdom with love. Dreams, to reveal this in the dreams of many empaths I have observed. One sees water of the fast, dark oceans, floods, or submerged houses. Water, as the unconscious, speaks of overwhelm, but also it reflects the feminine, the archetype of receptivity, of feeling, of the great mother. And when these waters rise, it is often a signal from the psyche that the self is drowning in unprocessed emotional residue. It is calling through image and symbol for the dreamer to re-establish a center, to rebuild an island upon which they can stand, rather than sink. These dreams do not lie. They point to the fundamental task of individuation, reclaiming one's own feeling, life without dissolving into the emotions of others. And here arises the paradox. The true empath is not one who feels for others, but one who has first reclaimed their own interiority. It is not a gift of absorption, but of discernment. To feel with, not instead of, to witness, not to be consumed. And this differentiation is only possible when the root wound has been brought to consciousness, grieved, and symbolized. Only then does the empath transform into the seer one who knows not just what others feel, but why they feel, and more importantly, what is theirs to carry and what is not. I remember a patient, a woman who came to me in middle age, exhausted, yet shimmering with a light she herself could not name. She had lived decades attuning to the sorrows of her children, her husband, her co-workers. Everyone came to her. You're so good at listening. They'd say, yet inside, she was crumbling. She wept not from others' pain, but from her own absence. I don't know who I am if I'm not helping someone. She confessed in analysis. We discovered the image of the invisible child, a dream where she wandered a vast house, unseen, always tidying after ghostly figures. And I ask her, as I ask you now, who tidies your soul? Who sees your original face before the world carved it into caretaker? Our journey, like that of many empaths, was the journey of reclaiming the self beneath the sensitivity. And it was not easy. It involved rage, righteous, ancient, buried rage. For the empaths must eventually confront the truth that their gift was born of neglect, and that the very people who praised their compassion often contributed to the necessity of its creation. This betrayal must be named, for until it is named, one remains bound to the archetype of the rescuer, a mask that hides the need to be rescued. And so we must walk with care here. For to strip away the fantasy of the natural empaths is to enter dangerous terrain. It is to tell someone that what they thought made them special may in fact be what has kept them in chains. But liberation, true liberation, lies beyond the fantasy. It lies in the integration of the wound, in the decision to no longer wear it as identity, but to offer it back to the soul as offering. If you are ready, I will continue into the final phase of this mystical lecture, a descent into the shadow. And then, if we are brave, a return toward wholeness. Would you like me to continue? When we peel back the layers of what is commonly misunderstood as sensitivity, what we find is not a soul born overly porous, but a soul that had to become porous in order to survive. This permeability is not a natural state, but an acquired defense, a necessary adaptation that allowed the individual to remain attuned to danger, to anticipate the moods of volatile caretakers, to intuit emotional threats before they manifested. The empath, in this sense, is not a gifted vessel overflowing with spiritual intuition, but a fortress without walls, laid bare from too many sieges, endured too early. One might ask, but what then of the soul's gift? Is it not divine to feel so deeply? And here I must be very careful. The spiritualization of trauma is a seductive narcotic. To assign sanctity to wounds is to risk never healing them. It is to wrap suffering in the garments of superiority and call it destiny. But the soul does not require pain to evolve. Rather, pain is what the ego experiences when the soul is ignored through empathy, not the hypervigilant mimicry of the wounded child. Arises not from pain, but from integration. It emerges when one has dared to turn inward and face the monstrous face in the mirror, the shadow self that holds all the denied rage, envy, hunger, and grief that the empath was never allowed to express. Until that moment, the empath is not really relating to others. They are reacting to ghosts. Ghosts of the father who never came home. The mother whose tears demanded silence. The schoolyard where laughter turned into betrayal. The empath's intuition is not prophetic, it is reactive. It is finely tuned, yes, but it is tuned to trauma. In my own studies of the psyche, I encountered many such beings, men and women, who believed themselves to be spiritually gifted, when in fact they were spiritually dislocated. Their so-called empathy was a symptom of dissociation. Their compassion, a mask for terror. They had learned to disappear from themselves in order to merge with others, hoping to become indispensable, irreplaceable, because as children they felt utterly disposable. Their power came not from presence, but from absence, the absence of self, of boundaries, of the right to say no. The archetype at play here is the wounded healer, that ancient symbol of Chiron, the centaur who could not heal his own wound. And this, my friends, is where the danger lies. For the empath who identifies too closely with their wound risks becoming addicted to the pain, they believe that to feel is to be alive. And to feel everything is to be more alive than others. They wear their raw nerves like badges of honor, confusing overexposure with authenticity. But the soul is not a sponge. It is not meant to absorb the world's suffering like some sacrificial lamb. The soul is a crucible, a container in which suffering must be transformed, not merely held. If we are to truly evolve, we must challenge the myth that the empath is born. No one is born with a fractured boundary system. No infant comes into this world ready to anticipate the emotions of the other. What is innate is the potential for resonance, the capacity to feel, to attune, but the compulsive need to always attune, to make oneself responsible for what others feel, that is a pathology of survival. That is the echo of a childhood where feeling safe depended on making others comfortable. And this is why the empath, when unhealed, often attracts the narcissist because the narcissist demands attunement without reciprocity. And the unhealed empath is conditioned to give without receiving. This dynamic is not merely psychological, it is alchemical. The empath and the narcissist represent two poles of the same wound, the fear of being unseen. The narcissist inflates the self to become visible, while the empath erases the self to remain acceptable. Both are running from the same dragon, the void within, and both must, at some point, stop running and turn inward to face it. So how does the empath begin this journey? It starts with grief, deep, primal grief for the childhood that was spent managing others' emotions instead of discovering one's own. Grief for the years lost in the labyrinth of caretaking, for the friendships that were really trauma bonds, for the love that had to be earned through self-abandonment. This grief cannot be bypassed. It must be allowed to burn through the psyche like a sacred fire, purging the false self that grew from the wound. And then comes the reclamation, the moment the empath stops asking, what do they need from me? And begins to ask, what do I need? This is the birth of the true self, not the hyper-attuned ghost of the past, but the embodied soul that knows where it ends and the world begins. It is a terrifying birth, because it often requires disappointing others, breaking roles, becoming visible in ways that attract judgment. But it is also the only path to wholeness. Empathy, in its highest form, is not the absorption of pain, but the transmutation of it. It is the capacity to witness another without merging, to care without rescuing, to stand firm in one's truth while honoring the truth of the other. And this kind of empathy cannot grow in the soil of a wounded identity. It requires boundaries, self-trust, and the courage to be misunderstood. Do not worship your wound. Do not make a shrine of your suffering. Instead, you study it. Sit with it as you would a strange and ancient god. Ask it what it wants from you. Ask it why it chose you. And then, when it answers, do not recoil. Listen, because your wound does not want to define you. It wants to free you. The empath, who is no longer ruled by the wound, becomes something else entirely, not a sponge, but a mirror, not a rescuer, but a guide. They stop absorbing the pain of others and begin reflecting the truth. They become initiators into the sacred darkness, midwives of the inner child, keepers of the fire that can illuminate the hidden corners of the soul. This is their true calling, not to bleed for the world, but to show the world how to stop bleeding. When I say that empaths are wounded, I do not mean to reduce their experience, I mean to sanctify it. For the wound, once integrated, becomes a portal, and through that portal we meet the divine, not in the ecstasy of fusion, but in the integrity of separation. We are not here to become each other. We are here to become ourselves, fully, fiercely, and without apology. And so I leave you with this: to be an empath is not to be special. It is to be called to heal, to awaken, to embody the boundaries you were never taught. And if you accept this calling not as a curse, but as an initiation, then you will not just feel the world, you will help transform it. And yet, the most dangerous illusion an empath may carry is the illusion that their sensitivity is a virtue devoid of wound. This is not so. True empathy is forged in the crucible of suffering. It arises not from moral superiority, but from survival of emotional fragmentation, of abandonment, of bearing the unbearable. The child who becomes the adult empath was not trained in love, but in danger. She watched the moods of others with intensity, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. In such homes where the parent is emotionally volatile, narcissistic, depressive, or addicted, the child becomes a silent seismograph of storms. She scans the emotional air not to help others, but to stay alive. This kind of empathy is hypervigilance in disguise. It is not born of care, but of fear. It is a reflex, a defense, an ancient coping mechanism wrapped in the spiritual veneer of compassion. And herein lies the chilling truth. The empath, often glorified, is not a saint, but a survivor. She has learned to feel what others feel, because the price of not doing so was neglect, punishment, or even annihilation. And though she may be praised for her insight and depth, the truth remains. The empath is the one who bore the pain of others so completely, she forgot to feel her own. But what happens when an empath awakens, when she begins to see that what she called love was actually adaptation, that what she called connection was enmeshment, and that what she thought was her greatest gift was a scar carried like a badge, then the real journey begins. Then she must descend into the underworld of her own psyche, into the layers of grief and rage and confusion, long buried under the masks of caretaking. And in that descent, she may meet for the first time the ghost of the child she once was, the tender, frightened creature who needed to be seen, held, protected, but was instead made the protector. Empathy must be reclaimed through individuation, through shadow work, through the painful realization that one does not owe their life to the regulation of others' emotions. An empath must ask, who was I before the wound? Who am I when I am not performing emotional labor for the world? What feelings are truly mine? To reclaim oneself in this way is not selfishness, it is salvation. It is a step toward psychic integrity, toward becoming whole, rather than merely good. And the archetypes will guide her, as they always do. The wounded healer, the mother, the shadow, the trickster. They will visit her dreams and speak in images and symbols, whispering truths she dared not name aloud. A snake appearing in her bed, representing primal energy suppressed. A house with too many rooms, fragmented psyche, an ocean, rising unfelt emotion ready to burst. Each dream will be a revelation, a breadcrumb in the dark forest of rebecoming. As she follows them, she may begin to notice something miraculous. Her empathy, once compulsive, becomes conscious. No longer an obligation, it becomes a choice. She may still feel deeply, but now, with boundaries, she may still intuit the pain of others, but she no longer absorbs it like a sponge. She may walk into a room and feel the air shift, but now she knows it is not her job to fix what she did not break. And in this way, She is no longer just an empath. She is an alchemist, one who has transmuted her pain into power, her wounding into wisdom. The gift remains, but it is no longer a wound. It is a tool. I do not speak these things to condemn empathy, but to liberate it, to strip it of the spiritual bypassing and romanticization it so often receives. Empathy is not your identity. It is the residue of your survival. And only when you trace it back to its origin can you choose, truly choose, to wield it differently, to use it in service of truth, not trauma, in love, not fear. So let us now sit with the final truth. Perhaps the most difficult of all, your greatest sensitivity may have been forged in your greatest violation. And that is not your shame. It is your myth. It is your path. To walk it consciously is to awaken from the trance of people-pleasing, to step beyond the martyrdom of the empath and into the fierce and sacred fire of self-possession. That is where you are headed, not back into the past to rescue the ones who wounded you, but forward into a future where your empathy is no longer your cage, but your compass. And that, my dear soul, is a work of a lifetime. But let us now arrive at the deeper revelation. The path forward for the empath is not merely about shielding oneself or mastering boundaries. Although these are crucial thresholds, the true path is alchemy, the transmutation of pain into wisdom, of raw sensitivity into the gold of individuation. For the empath's wound, if not examined, becomes a prison. But once gazed upon with the eye of truth, it becomes a sacred wound, an opening to the divine. I have witnessed in countless dreams and analyses that when an empath ceases to run from their pain, when they stop calling it only a burden, they begin to harvest meaning from it. They find a capacity to see into the hearts of others not as a curse, but as a sacred faculty. This, however, is not sentimental empathy. It is not self-neglect in disguise. It is not martyrdom. It is the birth of the wounded healer, the archetype who walks into the underworld not to escape or to save, but to bring illumination. In myth, the wounded healer is often seen limping, carrying the mark of their pain like a torch. Chiron, the centaur, could not heal himself, and yet his very wound became the source of his wisdom. Likewise, the empath must ask, am I merely bleeding, or am I becoming a vessel through which healing flows? The answer lies in whether one has truly faced the shadow. To heal as an empath is not to become less sensitive. It is to become more conscious of what that sensitivity demands. The soul does not merely want to feel, it wants to transform. It wants to remember the ancient capacity to carry pain not as a weight, but as a symbol, a message from the deep psyche that says, this is how the world speaks through you. But to do so, the empath must release the false identity of being merely a sponge and awaken into the deeper identity of being a mirror, one that reflects, not absorbs. I have always believed that the soul is drawn to its own healing. If you are born with the seed of empathy, perhaps it is because your soul longed to transmute the very field of your ancestral suffering. Your body may still remember the mother's scream, the father's absence, the night the house went silent from terror. But your spirit remembers a vow, I will not let this story end in pain. I will feel what others refuse to feel. And in doing so, I will awaken what has long been dead in the world. This is the true empath, not a victim of sensation. But an alchemist of feeling, if this has stirred your depths, do not rush to label or to fix yourself. Instead, sit with your wound, speak to it, ask it what it has kept for you. It is not your enemy, it is your oracle. The pain you feel was once love that had nowhere to go. Let it go now. Let it fly upward like incense. And from the ashes, let a new self rise, one not afraid to feel, but also not enslaved by feeling. In the final analysis, the empath is the one who has walked the desert of abandonment and returned carrying water. But remember that water must be first offered to the self. You must drink from the well of your own healing before you can offer it to the world. You are not born an empath. You are initiated into it through pain, but you are not meant to stay there. You are meant to emerge as the healer, as the torchbearer, as the one who knows my wound was not my end. It was my beginning. And so I leave you with this: let your empathy no longer be the chain that binds you to others' suffering. Let it become the wings by which you fly above the ruins of your past. For only then does the empath transcend the wound and embody the gift. And that, my friend, is when the real transformation begins.